Anybody who thought that Russian President Vladimir Putin's expansionist agenda ends with Ukraine is sadly mistaken. Putin has his fingers in a lot of pies. Moldova is also on his agenda. Typically, he tries to use hybrid warfare tactics rather than direct military force to get what he wants in that country. But that may be about to change. Transnistria, and by extension Moldova itself, needs to prepare for potential escalations, as concerns about Putin's intentions persist. That warning comes from Moldova's Prime Minister, Dorin Recean, who spoke to the Financial Times on June 5 to tell the world that Russia is planning to amass a staggering 10,000 troops inside Transnistria. The region, which lies to Moldova's east and is currently classed as a separatist state, is Putin's latest target for a simple reason. He believes he can use Transnistria as a route into mainland Moldova if a war ever breaks out. The Financial Times points out that Russian soldiers in Transnistria are nothing new. They've been there for decades, thanks to the region being controlled by Russian separatists for around 33 years. However, recently Putin hasn't been able to send more soldiers to the region because it's landlocked and lies between Ukraine and Moldova. Recean has expressed concern that this could change. This is a huge effort to undermine Moldovan democracy, Recean declared to the Financial Times. They want to consolidate their military presence in the Transnistrian region. It seems that Recean is looking toward the future with these comments. Right now, that consolidation can't happen due to Russia's war with Ukraine. It's not that Russia can't spare the troops necessarily. Rather, to get them to Transnistria, it would need to push all of the way through to Ukraine's west. But more likely is that Putin will first need to defeat Ukraine before he can turn his attention to Moldova and Transnistria. The possibility of that defeat happening is what worries Recean. You can imagine with 10,000 troops what the leverage and pressure would be on the southwestern part of Ukraine. Recean says as he points out that it's not just Moldova that needs to worry about Putin's ambitions, but also close to Romania, which is a NATO member state. Recean is sounding the alarm here. He's telling NATO that it can't assume that Putin injecting 10,000 soldiers into Transnistria is a Moldovan problem. It's an issue that affects Ukraine, especially if Russia's leader can pull it off without having to defeat Ukraine, and a problem that ultimately threatens to have a major impact on NATO's strength in Europe. Recean didn't say how he thinks Putin will transport those 10,000 soldiers to Transnistria, but perhaps he doesn't have to. The possibility of it happening is more than enough to showcase the threat Putin poses beyond Ukraine. Transnistria itself also poses an interesting geopolitical conundrum to the rest of the world. Lying to Moldova's east on the east bank of the Dniester River, it's a narrow strip of land measuring just 1,350 square miles. It's also an interesting region thanks to its jumbled history. At various points in time, Transnistria has been controlled by the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, though it's now meant to come under Moldova's control. Only that hasn't happened. Instead, Transnistria has been a separatist state with Russian sympathies almost since the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's a problem for Moldova, as Encyclopedia Britannica points out. Transnistria is home to several aspects of Moldovan industry, much of which carries over from the Soviet era. It's also where Moldova has typically gotten around 80% of its electricity, according to Interfax. That electricity is generated using Russian gas, creating a complex situation in which Russia is already able to exert some control over Moldova via its energy needs. It's used that power in the past, such as in 2005, when the separatist state stopped paying for Russian gas, cutting Moldova's electricity in the process. Even now, this incident has led to the non-recognized state owing $11.1 billion to Russia, claimed the Carnegie Endowment in February. Russian energy company Gazprom also says that Moldova itself owes $709 million, though Moldova disputes that, claiming its arrears only amount to $8.6 million. So there's a complicated economic situation at play due to Transnistria's desire to separate from Moldova. It's a situation that plays right into Putin's hands. And to make matters worse, there's still a very heavy Russian influence in Transnistria. The BBC says that the region is dominated by Russian speakers, with only 40% of its population able to speak Moldovan. Transnistria also has its own parliament, currency, flag, national anthem, and constitution, all of which mark its status as a breakaway state. A state that is plenty sympathetic to Russia. As mentioned earlier, and as Recean himself points out, the presence of Russian troops inside Transnistria is nothing new. The BBC notes that the region is believed to be home to a large Soviet-era stockpile of weapons and military installations. And for most of its history, Transnistria has allowed Moscow to station 2 military contingents on its territory. One of these is a supposed peacekeeping unit, whereas the other is the remnant of the former Soviet 14th Army, the BBC says. Moldova keeps calling for the withdrawal of these troops. Both Russia and Transnistria ignore these requests. The Financial Times offers more details about these Russian troop deployments. It says that the Russian Federation used to station large numbers of its soldiers in Transnistria, starting in 1992 when the separatists in Transnistria first started gearing up for a war of independence from Moldova. That war ended in a ceasefire declared on July 21, 1992, after fighting killed an estimated 700 people. Since then, Russia has backed off bit by bit. The Financial Times reports that there are now believed to be about 1,500 soldiers operating in Transnistria under Russia's command. That figure refers to most of these soldiers not being troops that Russia has dispatched itself. Instead, most are Transnistrian locals who've joined the Russian force in what appears to be an effort to defend their territory. Perhaps that provides a clue as to how Putin will get 10,000 soldiers into Transnistria. Rather than sending those soldiers from Russia, he might instead create a recruitment campaign in the territory itself to bolster Russia's numbers. At this stage, that remains speculative. But Recean isn't concerned about the forces that are already in the separatist state. Currently, their forces there are almost meaningless, he tells the Financial Times. The big concern comes from the potential build-up. But with a higher military presence in Transnistria that a Russia-leaning government can allow for, they can consolidate. Recean adds that the 10,000 estimate comes from the intelligence assessments, again without stating the source of those assessments. What Recean seems to be worried about here is a twofold problem. First, the injection of 10,000 Russian troops into Transnistria has the potential to bolster the paramilitary forces already in the region to the point where they can more actively rebel against Moldova. Would that lead to a direct war? That remains uncertain, but the region's history suggests that it could be seen, as Moldova and the Transnistrian separatists have fought in the past. The second problem is that Putin would make an already pro-Russian Transnistrian government beholden to him. Russia's leader would have more influence in the region than ever before, which leads to the reason why Putin is so interested in Transnistria in the first place. His goal is to assert control over Moldova. What Recean says is due to happen in Transnistria is just the latest part of that plan. Rewind to 2024, and accusations were flying that Putin had engaged in a massive influence campaign inside Moldova's borders. According to the Financial Times, 2024 alone saw Russia allegedly spend 1% of Moldova's entire gross domestic product, which Statista says was $18.126 billion, on a combined online propaganda and illegal cash transfer campaign. That campaign appeared to be an effort to influence Moldova's referendum on joining the European Union, or EU. It failed. The referendum for EU membership passed in favour of the EU by just 0.7% of Moldova's voters, a point that will be returned to soon. The Financial Times dug into this campaign in October 2024. It reported on the oligarch Ilan Shor, who Moldova's police accused of attempting to use his vast influence to sway voters wherever he could. That influence, built on the back of Russian funds, supposedly allowed Ilan Shor to run a tight-knit network of voters across the country that he can bribe and deploy to vote on Moscow's behalf. It almost worked. Some would even say that Putin achieved his goal. The Financial Times says that Shor was working to prevent Moldova from casting its collective vote to join the EU. Prior to that referendum, the country's president, Maia Sandu, believed that her referendum would result in a resounding yes to EU membership. That's not what happened. The yes still came, but scraping through based on 0.7% of the vote is far from the resounding victory Sandu expected, and it showcases just how deep Russia's tendrils run into Moldova. Russian election interference, which Sandu labelled as being done by criminal gangs and foreign forces spending dirty money to steal votes, didn't stop there. Russia also seems to have succeeded in preventing Sandu from securing re-election to the role of president at around the same time, forcing a runoff election on November 3rd, 2024, that Sandu ultimately won. On June 4, Pravda reported that pro-Russian bots created a campaign depicting Sandu being executed. The bots posted fake graffiti pictures of Sandu dying by hanging, shooting, and even in electric chairs, the outlet says. Just days before, Pravda says, the Fund for Combating Repression website, which was founded by former Wagner mercenary group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, ran a story accusing Sandu of being involved in trafficking Ukrainian children. Moldova's president, it seems, is still as much of a target for Putin as she was in 2024. Shaw's tactic was interesting because his bribery didn't just extend to giving money to voters, he was also very active as a community force in regions, including Gagauzia, the Financial Times report. There, the vote to join the EU was the lowest in all of Moldova, with just 5% voting yes. Uncoincidentally, the Financial Times says Shaw has invested money into improving the local park. In winter, they want to do an ice ring. A resident named Tatiana Kvirzink told the Financial Times. Everybody steals. She also said when asked about Shaw's reputation, but some steal in a better way. Gagauzia is another interesting case on its own, the Financial Times points out. Like Transnistria, it's always seen itself as separate from the rest of Moldova. Upon the Soviet Union's collapse, it voted for independence. Ultimately, it accepted becoming an autonomous region within Moldova, rather than an outright separatist state. Still, the situation there in Transnistria and in many other Moldovan regions demonstrate why Recean is now so worried about the 10,000 troops he believes Russia is ready to amass. Time and time again, Putin proves he wants to control Moldova. What's about to happen in Transnistria is just the latest step. Until that move happens, Putin is going to do everything that he can to keep Moldova in a state of political limbo. That's according to the Carnegie Endowment, which says that Putin is currently playing for time as he waits for the perfect opportunity to strike. His tactics include fueling disenchantment and stalling any reforms that have the chance to take a pro-EU route, the Carnegie Endowment says, all of which was seen in 2024 during the EU referendum. The Carnegie Endowment also notes that it's not just the active meddling Moldova has to worry about. A troubling side effect of Russian meddling is the strain on Moldovan state resources, it says, pointing out that Moldova is a country of only 3 million people. Its state institutions seem to run in a state of perpetual deficit, the Carnegie Endowment points out. That makes it all the easier for a country with a lot of money to stretch those already thin resources to their breaking point before stepping in to splash the cash and gain influence. Just look at Shaw and his park. An oligarch coming in to pay for a park upgrade that Moldova couldn't afford, possibly due to Russia's actions elsewhere, was enough to influence the vote in that region further away from the EU than it otherwise might have gone. It all points to Putin playing a very clever game in which he engages in multiple actions of hybrid warfare against Moldova that are designed to weaken the country before a full-fledged takeover attempt. Perhaps the 10,000 troops heading into Transnistria is a sign that Putin thinks that a full takeover effort is drawing closer. But why does Russia's leader care so much about Moldova? Recean already highlighted one of the reasons when he pointed out that Transnistria is close to Romania. Taking control of the region allows Russia to operate close to the border of a NATO member. The Russian tendrils could then start to spread even further. Control over Transnistria and potentially the invasion and annexation of Moldova that might result could lead to Putin pulling the same kinds of hybrid warfare tricks to influence developments in Romania. And it's not just Romania that has to worry. Imagine the worst case scenario for a moment. Russia wins in Ukraine, followed by using the 10,000 troops it has stationed in Transnistria, combined with forces from the Russian mainland to overrun Moldova. Suddenly, Russia has control over two former states that border far more NATO allies than Romania alone. Poland, Slovakia and Hungary would all have to deal with the Russian problem. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia wouldn't be safe either. They border Belarus, which is a Russian ally. And if Russia can use its control over Moldova to influence geopolitics in Romania, that would also be good news for Putin in the Black Sea. It's all about creating an ever-expanding web of Russian influence for Putin, a web that would allow him to also maintain a threat against NATO and the European Union. And that leads back to the EU issue mentioned earlier in the video. In October 2024, right before the EU referendum that narrowly passed in Moldova, the Centre for European Reform posted a document outlining why Putin is so intent on controlling the country. If either Georgia or Moldova slipped into Russia's orbit after these elections, it will be a setback for EU and wider Western interests in the Black Sea region, the report says. A Moscow-aligned Moldova would potentially offer Russia a base from which to attack southwestern Ukraine's grain exporting ports. The centre also says that Russia's success in convincing Moldova to reject the EU would showcase to other potential member states that achieving membership alone isn't enough to guarantee the development of a stable and prosperous democracy. In other words, Putin's wider aim is to use Moldova to weaken the EU's influence to the point where Russia may start to seem like a better alternative. Of course, it's now known that Russia failed to get Moldova to reject EU membership. But, as the Financial Times reports, the razor-thin margin by which that referendum passed is still good news for Putin. Russia is likely to view the outcome as something of a win, as it can capitalize on the closeness of the results to try to delegitimize the referendum and generally stoke divisions in the country. The Financial Times claims that analysts said, ultimately, everything Russia is doing in Transnistria is in service of reducing westernization in Moldova. And by doing that, Putin delegitimizes everything that the EU is attempting to do on the European continent. All of which leads back to Recean and his warning. The 10,000 troops set to arrive in Transnistria are just the latest in a series of moves Putin has used to destabilize Moldova. The question now is simple: is there anything Moldova can do about it? Militarily, there likely isn't much. If Russia were to go to war with Moldova, it would almost certainly win. A comparison of the two countries provided by Global Firepower, which ranks 145 nations each year based on their military power, shows us that. Moldova, it says, ranks 134th out of those 145 nations. Russia is second. Even if the comparison is dialed down to only include the 10,000 soldiers in Transnistria, things don't look great for Moldova. It has an active military of just 8,500 personnel. Granted, it has 67,000 reserves to call upon, but in the immediate sense, 10,000 Russian troops in Transnistria gives the separatist region a solid manpower advantage. If Putin is serious about starting a war with Moldova, he could also inject more troops into Transnistria as is when they're needed, allowing him to whittle away at Moldova's already small reserve forces. The point here is that a fight is the last thing that Moldova wants. Right now, the Moldovan focus seems to be on winning the propaganda war that's already underway. Recean says as much to the Financial Times, stating, "We're very cautious because their propaganda, their communication mechanisms are very powerful. They're spending a lot of money. Moldova's response has to match that spending," says the country's Prime Minister. Correspondingly, we have to step up our defences as well, but we also have to deliver on our agenda. That agenda is to follow through on the successful referendum result to make Moldova an official member of the EU. When that will happen is anybody's guess. As of June 2022, Moldova has been in candidate status with the EU. Official accession negotiations opened in June 2024, meaning talks have been underway for a year without Moldova gaining membership. That time hasn't been wasted though. On June 5, the Enlargement and Eastern Neighbourhood Division of the EU released remarks made by European Commission Vice President Kaja Kallas during a joint press conference at the Association Council meeting. Kallas noted that the partnership between Moldova and the EU is stronger than ever. She lauded Moldova for contributing to EU missions in Somalia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, as well as praising the country for hosting more Ukrainian refugees than any other country per capita. The EU has also heavily invested in Moldova, Kallas said.
We have provided to you nearly €200 million in vital defense aid to support Moldova to modernize its armed forces.
That sort of spending suggests that the EU wants Moldova to become a member. The internal divisions within the country seem to be the only thing holding Moldova back. The Transnistria problem doesn't go away if Moldova becomes an EU member. Putin will still amass 10,000 troops in Transnistria. But at least with full EU membership, Moldova will make Putin think twice before invading. That, much more than Moldova's military, could be the deterrent needed to stop Russia in its tracks. Of course, Transnistria is far from the only place where Putin is looking to amass large numbers of soldiers. Other nations, such as Finland, are starting to see Russian buildups on their borders. Discover what Finland's president had to say about Putin's border efforts and how he humiliated Russia's leader by checking out our video. And remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering the latest moves Putin is making to try to gain influence in Europe.